Hi students, it's Dr. Marks and our topic for today is environmental externalities. Now, I'm going to talk about externalities in general, but we'll use some environmental examples. In this lecture, I'm going to make sure to explain the idea of externality, and it's going to take a little bit. The definition is a little bit bulky, but we'll go through it slowly. And we're going to use some environmental examples. Not all examples of externalities are environmental, but there's plenty of them. And then we're going to discuss how the presence of externalities leads to market failure. And I understand at this point, most of you don't know what I mean by externalities or market failure, but we're going to cover this very carefully, and you need to be able to make those connections. And then we need to talk about how we address this idea of market failure. What do? We don't want to just roll up our sleeves and say, oh, nothing we can do about it. We definitely want to try to take measures that will help us eradicate market failure. Let's talk about markets for just a few minutes so everyone has a good background. I know you are all aware that we live in a capitalistic economy, right? And when we live in a capitalistic economy, that means that markets organize most of the economic activity in our society. Not all, but most. So there are some things that markets don't do, but generally markets are what organize economic activity in a capitalistic society. So some of you may have had high school economics, or if you're in the business school, you understand the idea of a market. We're talking about supply and demand, and suppliers and demanders come together for the purpose of exchange. We're not going to be doing a lot of supply and demand graphing or anything like that, so if all of a sudden you're starting to get worried, don't worry. We're going to keep this very simple. But when we say markets organize most of the economic activity in our society, we mean as opposed to government, right? If you go behind the Iron Curtain many years ago, you would have seen government organizing economic activity. How much food people got might have been a function of government allocations or government rations. That's not how we do things in a capitalistic economy. So whether you're buying a car or you're shopping for a house, maybe you're competing for a job after you graduate, these are all things that are taking place in the market. Economists like markets. All of us at Longwood University are going to be telling our students over and over again that markets are really good. And one of the things that we like about markets and market economies is that markets are usually efficient. So when I talk about efficiency in the marketplace, you need to understand what I mean by that. And what I mean by that, when I say that markets are usually efficient, I mean that they result in the flow of resources to their most valued use. So in a market economy, resources are going to flow where they're most highly valued. Now think about under communism and central planning. Would that have been true? Would they have ensured that labor, for example, was allocated to where they were most valuable? No, of course not. Would they have ensured that resources and natural resources were used where they were most highly valued? No, because governmental outcomes don't necessarily give us that same kind of result. So economists like market because markets are efficient, meaning that resources are going to flow to where they are most highly valued. They're going to flow to their most valued use. But markets also ensure that the right amount of things are produced. And you see my quotes, right? That the right amount of things are produced. And when we say the right amount, we mean the socially optimal amount, the optimal level for society. So markets are efficient, resources flow to their most highest valued use, and markets produce the amount that's right, that's socially optimal. So what this means is that we're not overproducing or underproducing. We're not over allocating resources and we're not under allocating resources. So think about it as Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. So markets are really good. Now, don't worry if you've never seen supply and demand. I'm throwing this out there for those of you who have, and those of you that will understand this. It's not very complicated. But when we think about a market, we usually draw it this way with demand and supply. And the demand and supply comes together to create an equilibrium. And so just to keep it very simple, in this graph you see our demand curve and our supply curve, and they interact, right? Consumers and producers basically are interacting in the marketplace, and we end up with a market price. You see that market price on the left, P star. So if the market is efficient, then what that tells us is this equilibrium price, P star, is the right price to charge. And the equilibrium quantity, Q star, is the right quantity to produce. So this is what is best for society. This is what makes sense. Charge price P, produce quantity Q. But there's one thing that markets cannot do, and this is where it kind of falls apart a little bit in terms of efficiency. Markets cannot force consumers and producers to think about externalities. The market just can't make a consumer think about externalities. The market cannot make a producer think about externalities. And by the way, that's why we call them externalities, right? Look at the front of that word, external. These are things that are external to the marketplace. So consumers and producers don't think about externalities when they're making decisions. Instead, consumers and producers make their decisions based on their private costs and their benefits. So what's in it for me, in other words? So if I go to the store and I'm making decisions, I want to know, what is this going to cost me? What is going to be the benefit to me, right? And so markets are really based on people making decisions based on their private costs and their private benefits, and it has nothing to do with externalities. All right, what exactly is an externality then? So let's go through the definition. When we define externality, we say that in the process of consumption, distribution, or production, so there could be three ways we end up with externalities: when people are consuming something, or maybe when a company is distributing something, imagine a whole bunch of trucks driving around, or when a factory maybe is producing something. So in the process of consumption, distribution, or production, there is a cost or a benefit that spills over to others. So something's going on, people are consuming something, or we're distributing something, or a factory might be producing something, and during those processes, there's either a cost or there's a benefit, and it spills over to others. So let's think about these others as these innocent bystanders. And when we say they're innocent bystanders, what we're saying is that they're not involved in the decision process related to consumption, distribution, or production, and they experience some benefit or cost, but it's from the action of others. So in the process of consumption, distribution, or production, there's a cost or a benefit, and that spills over to others. And those others are kind of like innocent bystanders. They're not involved in the decision process, but yet they still experience a benefit or a cost, but it really extends from the action of others. That's what we mean by an externality. When this impact that we're talking about, the one that extends to these innocent bystanders, when that impact is a cost, well, then we would say we have a negative externality, or we'll call it an external cost. So when there's something negative that impacts these innocent bystanders that they had nothing to do with, then we would say we've imposed on them a negative externality, or these innocent bystanders have experienced an external cost. But you also might see me call it a spillover cost, a spillover cost. So a negative externality, an external cost, or a spillover cost, those are all the same thing. Instead, when the impact is a benefit, so some benefit has now extended to these innocent bystanders, we would say we have a positive externality, or an external benefit. So a positive externality or an external benefit, or we might call it a spillover benefit. So we have to think about, when we're talking about externalities, are these costs that are spilling over, or are these benefits that are spilling over. Let's start with the example of a positive externality. So keep in mind, as I've defined below, when we're talking about a positive externality, we're talking about when a benefit spills over to individuals, right? These innocent bystanders who are not involved in the decision or the market exchange. So a benefit spills over to these innocent bystanders who aren't involved in the decision making. They're not involved in any market exchange. Let's use as our example of a positive externality a decision to get the COVID vaccine. It's true that when we get an immunization, it benefits us personally, right? So I decided to get the COVID vaccine, and for the most part, I'm thinking about how it's going to benefit me. What are the private benefits that are going to accrue to me? And obviously, none of us wanted to catch COVID. It was pretty scary, especially at the beginning. So we might have decided to get that vaccine on the private benefits. But we also need to appreciate that when we get immunized, it benefits others, right? Think about all those other people in society, all those people that you could give a disease to, all those other people you come into contact with. What we're saying then is the decision to get the COVID vaccine or any other immunization creates spillover benefits. So it's a positive externality or an external benefit or a spillover benefit. Those are all the same thing. This makes total sense. The idea behind immunizations is that it protects you privately, but it also creates social benefits that spill over to others. This means you have to make a decision. Do you want to get a vaccine or do you not want to get a vaccine? And my question is, if you got the COVID vaccine, did you factor in the benefits to all of the other people in society? Was that going through your mind, or was it really more about you? I'm guessing it's not likely that in your decision to get the COVID vaccine, you factored in all the benefits to others. And maybe you didn't get the COVID vaccine, but think about all the other vaccinations you have gotten, most likely. So I'm guessing it's not likely you sat down and said, wow, I'm going to get this vaccine because it's good for society and I need to think about all those other people that I want to protect. Now, it is true that you might have thought about your family. I definitely did. I've got a husband who's self-employed. If he gets really sick, he's going to lose a lot of income, and I'm a lot older than you guys, and my parents clearly are older than your parents. I think about them, but I didn't think about every single person in society. But here's the question. Would you have paid some huge price, maybe $500, simply because the social benefits are so high? Because they really are. The social benefits of getting vaccinated are really high, which means, okay, well, it would make sense that it might have a value more like $500. Well, I might have paid $500, but again, I don't think I would have paid it because I'm worried about everyone else. I might have paid it purely for my own benefit. So here's the problem. Can the market force us to care about others? So I know people who didn't get the vaccine. They didn't want it. And you have to say, well, what about all those other people? Well, can we force somebody to think about the others? Can the marketplace, right, supply and demand, force us to care about others in our decision to get the vaccine? Can the market force people to think about social benefits, the things that spill over to all those other people? Well, the answer is no, right? The market can't force you to think about others. As a result, vaccination was lower than the socially optimal level. We had a lot of people get vaccinated, but the vaccination rates in some areas were lower than maybe what would have been socially optimal or socially best. Again, the idea behind the immunization is that it creates benefits for society, not just benefits for you, although it definitely created benefits for individuals. But here's again the thing, we don't generally factor that into our decisions, right? So our decisions are made based on our own private benefits, and we often ignore all those other benefits. Let me create some graphics to help you think this through. Let's model consumer decisions. On the left, we've got the benefits to themselves, to the consumer. And the benefits of the vaccine is going to be the private benefits when their risks are reduced, right? I could not wait to get that vaccine because I was worried about my own personal health and maybe just those people in my immediate family. So benefits to myself and maybe just a few other people that I live with. On the right, we have to think about the costs. What are the costs to consumers? Well, we didn't have to pay to get the immunization. So the consumer decision related to the immunizations was to weigh their private benefits and their private costs. Nothing in there is taking into account all of those benefits to everyone else. What I'm saying is that there's something missing from the consumer's decision, right? We look at our private benefits, that's on the left. We look at our private costs, that's on the right, and that's really what we weigh when we're making decisions. The thing that's missing from our consumers' decisions is that spillover benefit, right? That externality. But we just argued that people don't really think about the spillover benefits when making their decisions. They think about the private benefits. So the benefits to themselves are the private benefits, but there are indeed spillover benefits, or, as we've said, a positive externality or an external benefit. Here's the problem, though. Really, the true benefits of getting immunized is the social benefits. We need to really add both of those together to think about social benefits. But again, do I think about social benefits in that way? Probably not. I'm thinking more about my private benefits. So we're back to this idea of market failure. Consumers think about their private benefits. Now, that doesn't make them greedy, it doesn't make them wrong, it's just how people make decisions when they're thinking about spending money or investing in something or making a decision that affects them. They don't, however, think about the social benefits. Hence, we have what we call in economics market failure. So let's talk about this idea of market failure. Be clear, when I say market failure, it's a little misleading. The market still works. When we say market failure, we're not saying the market is broken. We're not saying it no longer functions, and that's important. So the term market failure can be a little misleading. I want to be clear that we saw the market delivering vaccines to people during this period of time, during the pandemic, right? So the market wasn't broken. But what we're saying is that the market just does not result in the socially optimal level of the activity. So market failure, again, we're not saying the market is broken. We're just saying the market can't generate the socially optimal outcome, the outcome or level of activity that's best. And that's not the same as saying the market is broken. In other words, what we're saying with respect to the immunization, we end up with less than the socially optimal level. So back to this idea of vaccines, really society would have been better off with more vaccines, but there were a lot of people who didn't feel that the private benefits justified them. And of course, they end up just neglecting and ignoring any social benefits. Back to our graph, and again, I'm not going to ask you to do stuff with supply and demand, but I do think you'll follow this. If you look at our green demand curve, that's going to be you and me demanding the COVID vaccine. Now, ignore the fact that the price was really zero. This could be some other vaccine where the price wasn't zero. But the green demand curve is you and me. And that's you and me thinking about our private benefits. That demand curve reflects people's willingness to pay for something. And our willingness to pay for something reflects what's in it for me, right? The private benefits. But if people were to think about social benefits, demand would be higher. So if I realize that, hey, it's not just about me, it's about protecting all kinds of other people because there's a spillover benefit, and I should be willing to consume the vaccine because the benefits are really big. It's not just private benefits. Well, again, I'm not saying people think that way. I'm saying theoretically, if they did, the demand would have been higher. It would have been more like that red dotted line. And look at what happens when we're on the red dotted line because our demand is higher. look what happens. We really want to be at Q1. That's the socially optimal level. But the market's going to bring us only to Q star. So do you see what I mean? The market's generating Q star, but society really wants Q1. We're better off if we're at Q1. So what has the market done? It has resulted in too little. Let's talk about some other external benefits that are out there. I know that we haven't been talking about an environmental example, but immunizations is a good one, and I know you understand it. We could be thinking about any kind of environmental cleanup, right? Think about making the air cleaner, thinking about water being cleaner. Anytime there's environmental cleanup, it creates an external benefit. It doesn't affect just the people doing the cleanup. It extends to a whole lot of other people as well, right? So it creates external benefits. Planting trees, that creates external benefits, right? We know that trees have positive impacts on the environment. When we plant trees, maybe I decide to plant trees, but it's going to spill over this societal benefit to others, right? It's not just a private benefit. It creates spillover benefits for others. There are other environmental examples. Maybe you're a contractor, you're developing a big tract of land, and we have laws that require land set-asides. So maybe you have to create some wetlands. And so when you're required to do things like set aside some of your land, it creates good habitat. You're not allowed to tear down the trees. This will have positive environmental benefits that spill over to others. And of course, protecting rainforests. Protecting rainforests, as we're going to learn a little bit more about later in this class, certainly has a big spillover benefit because rainforests are considered to be the lungs of the world, and they have so many important functions with respect to trying to reduce climate change. So all of these things create external benefits, not just for people that live in the rainforest, right? Obviously, people that live in the rainforest benefit when we protect those rainforests, but you and I benefit from protection of rainforests, and we have very little rainforest in the United States. So how do we address this idea of market failure, this idea that markets, when we have positive externalities, are going to result in too little, that we really want more? Well, when there's a positive externality involved, as we just said, we want more of the activity. The market's going to be to the left, right, on our supply and demand graph. The market's going to underproduce, to underallocate resources, and society really wants more. So how do we get more? And remember, as it reminds you in parentheses, the market can't solve this problem. The market can't make you buy more immunizations simply because there's benefits to others, right? So how can we get more? Or do we just say, oh, bummer, markets aren't going to function as well here. We're just going to have to suffer through some market failure? Well, the answer is no, because we can first of all use things like regulations and mandates to encourage things that are good. For example, to attend Longwood University, our institution requires vaccinations of students. Think about it. You're living in dorms with others. There's big spillover benefits to you guys when all of those people around you have their vaccinations. So we can mandate or use regulation to require something that is good. And so Longwood forcing people to have their vaccinations, really what they're doing is being good environmental economists, and they're making sure that they create a spillover benefit. But we can also use subsidies. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by a subsidy, we're talking about giving people money so that we lower the cost of something that's good. So if we want more of something, we subsidize, we give people money, we lower the cost. And so in this class, we might be concerned about lowering the cost for environmentally beneficial things. For example, you can get subsidies for hybrid cars. Basically, you are getting a certain amount of money off your taxes, which is basically free money, to lower the cost of your hybrid cars. And the same kind of thing for solar power. If you want to invest in solar power, you can get subsidies to reduce the cost. Now, does it make the costs go away? No, you don't get that hybrid car for free, but getting these subsidies that are built in to our government policies means that that hybrid car costs you a little less. If you're on the margin trying to decide if you want that hybrid car, that subsidy might be enough to put you over the top. The more we subsidize, the more of these good activities we're going to get. Let's move on to talk about a negative externality. So this is going to be the opposite case. In this case, we're talking about when a cost spills over to individuals. And again, we're talking about that cost spilling over to individuals who are innocent bystanders. They're not involved in the decision. They're not involved in any kind of market exchange. Nevertheless, they experience some kind of cost. So negative externality. Let's say that you live next to a factory, and let's use that as our negative externality because the factory pollutes as it produces. So obviously when that factory pollutes, it has emissions, and that's creating an external cost for you or a spillover cost for you. And now you have unclean air, maybe your house smells. Again, there are costs imposed upon you, and you had nothing to do with this, right? So you experience a negative externality or an external cost. What we're saying is that there's a social cost associated with production. Without regulation, firms aren't going to think about this pollution as a real cost. So without regulation, the firm doesn't say, oh wow, we're generating pollution, that's a cost. Now labor, that's a cost. Raw materials, that's a cost. So labor and raw materials are real costs to a producer. But pollution, you can understand that's not the same, right? And the market can't force the producers to think of pollution as a real cost, right? It's a social cost, but it's not a real cost that hits their accounting, right? It doesn't cost them any money. It doesn't cost them any resources because we're assuming, again, there's no regulation in place forcing them to deal with the pollution. So labor's a cost, raw materials are costs, but pollution, well, that's just a spillover cost. It's not really a real cost to the firm. So let's model producers' decisions. Well, on the left, they're producing something, and the benefits to the producers are going to be the money they make from selling to consumers. So whatever they're producing, they're going to sell it in the market. They're going to make money from consumers. On the right side, they think about the cost to produce it. What's the labor costs? What are the raw material costs? Are there energy costs? And there could be some other real costs. But when a producer's making their decision on how much to produce, they're thinking about costs versus benefits. But something is missing from the producer decisions, right? Just like what we said with the consumer decisions. Well, what's missing? What's missing is that there's a spillover cost, right? This externality, this external cost. That spillover cost is in the form of the emissions, the pollution that's affecting everyone in the neighborhood, but it may not really be a real cost of production to the firm. However, those together, those real costs to the firm and the spillover costs together, they create a social cost associated with production. So the social cost is both of the costs together. And that spillover cost is real to those people who are experiencing it, but it's not real in the same sense to the producers. So you see the problem that we have. Back to this idea of market failure. We just said there's a social cost associated with production, and that social cost is going to be the real cost of production, and it's going to be the spillover cost. But the firm doesn't think this way, right? They're not thinking about that spillover cost. unless they're forced to through regulation. Now, through regulation, we can force them to think about the cost, but for now, let's just assume there's no regulation, that the firm doesn't have to think about the pollution as a real cost, the same way they do labor costs, because they've got to write somebody a paycheck. But with the pollution, they don't, right? There's no cost. So can the market force the firm to think this way, to think about pollution as a real cost? Well, what's the answer? Can the market do that? Of course, we know the answer is no. Markets don't have the ability to force producers to think about pollution as if it's a real cost. If you're a consumer of this good, the one that's coming out of the factory and creating emissions and creating pollution and spillover costs for other, well, does the market make you pay more for this? I mean, after all, gosh, you're consuming something that has this negative effect. You should have to pay more. Is that how the market works? Well, the answer is no. You don't pay more because there's some spillover cost created from something that you're consuming. But your consumption is hurting the environment, right? Because if you didn't consume this, the factory wouldn't produce it and you wouldn't have this spillover cost. So you consuming this good is hurting the environment, but you don't have to pay any more because of it. And this is part of the market failure. The market doesn't capture these as real costs, and therefore it doesn't pass those real costs on to you as the consumer. So the bottom line is that the market just can't handle these types of non-dollar costs. Now, if labor costs go up, that's going to come back to you as a consumer. You're going to end up with a higher price, right? If Walmart has to pay more for labor, then they're going to raise their prices. You're going to pay it. But this is a non-dollar cost, right? Pollution and emissions are non-dollar costs. The market doesn't know how to handle that. It just can't do it. Therefore, the market's going to overproduce this item. It's going to produce more. We're going to have more resources allocated to this activity, which means society ends up with more than the optimal level, right? Because if something creates a spillover cost, we want less. So society ends up with more than the optimal level because the market is going to generate more than the optimal level. But on top of that, in the market, think about it, the price is going to be too low because you and I don't have to pay for that pollution that's generated when something you're consuming got produced, right? It doesn't charge consumers for the damage associated with this product. Well, again, this is the idea of market failure. So bottom line, the market is not efficient in this case. The market functions. The market is exchanging goods and services. They're available in the market to buy, but the level of activity in the market is not the level that is socially optimal. So back to our graph, and again, keeping it really simple. We've got demand and supply, but this time we're going to look at the supply curve. So look at that purple supply curve. That supply curve reflects the production decisions and the production costs of suppliers, of producers. So let's focus on that. And again, we know the market is going to charge a price P star and it's going to produce Q star. The market is indeed functioning. But here's the thing. If producers thought about social costs as real costs, then they would supply less. Now that red dotted supply curve, the market can't do anything with that. This is really just an abstraction, but that reflects a lower supply based on higher costs when you incorporate all the costs, not just those dollar costs. Market can't do anything about that, but if it could, think about it. Look where we are. Instead of the market providing Q star, the market is providing Q1. Do you see what's happening? Markets provide Q star, but the socially optimal level, when we think about the social costs of production, well, that's only Q1. So what is the market doing here? The market is producing too much. Now, let's look at the price. The market is going to charge a price of P star. But if we were really thinking about all of the social costs, if we were at that red dashed supply curve, look at what price we would set. We would set price P1. Now the market can't do that, but that tells us that the market underprices products when they have negative externalities associated with them. The market can't force people to pay more because there's a negative externality. Let's look at some other examples of negative externalities. Well, a great one is cigarette smoking, right? So you've been to a restaurant, well, maybe not now because we don't allow smoking, but think about where you're somewhere, maybe at a park, and somebody's sitting near you and the smoke is coming your way. Now, you had nothing to do with their decision to buy cigarettes or smoke cigarettes. You're not involved in any market exchange, yet there's a negative externality, right? A spillover cost that is affecting you. Same thing with noise pollution, and that is considered to be an environmental cost. Maybe there's construction going on. There could be traffic congestion. Gosh, it could just be my poor neighbor. I have 3 dogs and sometimes they bark. Noise pollution is a spillover cost, right? My neighbor had nothing to do with my decision to adopt 3 rescue dogs, but yet there's a cost imposed on him. And if somebody's building something at Longwood, there have been times where we've had just all this noise in the background as we're trying to teach, and that creates a negative externality for our students. Automobile exhaust is a great example of a mobile negative externality because we know as we drive around, emissions lower the air quality, and it's actually estimated to be quite a big problem. But those other people had nothing to do with my decision to drive or my decision about how much gas to consume, whether or not I have a hybrid car or a gasoline, fueled car. So automobile exhaust, another good example. And then, of course, anything related to dumping of toxic waste or other discharges, when we have that kind of activity, that creates a negative externality for others as well. So how do we address market failure here when we have externalities? As we've said, when there is a negative externality, we want less of the activity. The market is producing more, but society is better with less. So how do we get less? Because again, the market can't solve this problem, right? Well, just like with positive externalities, we can use regulation and mandates, in this case, to limit a negative externality. Think about all of the types of regulations and mandates with the EPA. Those are mostly about trying to reduce negative externalities. And the EPA forces compliance with these policies and it monitors. So regulation and mandates can encourage good behavior, and it can discourage bad behavior. So we see regulations and mandates related to both positive and negative externalities. With negative externalities, though, we would rely on something like taxes or fines. So with the subsidies we talked about earlier, that was for positive externalities, right? When we want more, but now we want less. So let's think about what happens when you tax something or you put a fine on something. What does it do? It increases the cost of something that's environmentally harmful, right? When you increase the cost, then you end up with less of it. And so the carbon tax that we see in some countries is a good example. When countries put a tax on carbon emissions, right, that's a negative externality, then they're likely to end up with less. Let's quickly summarize. We've said that markets focus on private costs and private benefits, right? That's how people like you and I make decisions. That's how producers make decisions. And we're not focusing on social costs and social benefits. They exist in a lot of cases when there are spillover benefits or spillover costs, but we don't often take those into account. So when externalities are present, whether they're positive externalities or they're negative externalities, markets are not efficient. Markets work, but they're not efficient. So be clear, I'm not saying they're broken. Markets can still work, they're still functioning, but they are not setting the optimal level of output. So markets are efficient until we have an externality. And once we have an externality, markets just don't know how to handle it. Markets still work, but they are no longer efficient because they're not setting the optimal level of output. This means that government plays a major role in addressing market failure. We don't want to just tolerate market failure. We want to do something about market failure. So we've talked about things like taxes, subsidies, policies, mandates, and regulation. And it's important you understand, when would you tax, when would you subsidize? If you have any questions, let me know. I thank you for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.